Imagine a world where a humble and obscure faith takes root amidst the grandeur of Rome, challenging centuries-old traditions and rising to conquer hearts and minds across the empire. A religion that promises hope, immortality, and unity, but not without resistance, conflict, and transformation. Welcome to today's episode, where we unravel the fascinating journey of Christianity during Rome's most tumultuous era. From its secret gatherings in catacombs to its miraculous spread across continents, this chapter of Edward Gibbon's masterpiece exposes the pivotal moments that reshaped an empire and arguably the world. How did this fledgling faith triumph over Roman polytheism? What role did the promise of eternal life play? And what of the supernatural tales that enthralled believers and baffled skeptics alike? Prepare to dive deep into a tale of resilience, controversy, and faith. Stay with us as we explore the rise of Christianity and its lasting legacy. Believe me, this is one episode you won't want to miss. Grand finale of part 1 of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Episode 15, How Rome Fell and Christianity Rose. A story of faith and power.
All right, let's dive in. We're journeying back to the Roman Empire to explore the rise of early Christianity.
Really fascinating stuff.
And our guide for this deep dive is Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Specifically chapter 15, which offers a really intriguing perspective on how this small sect, exploded onto the scene and completely reshaped the religious landscape.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it.
So the Roman Empire at this time, it was a melting pot of beliefs, right? You had everything from the official state religion to these mystery cults philosophies from Greece, even influences from the East.
Yeah, it was incredibly diverse. You had all these different belief systems coexisting relatively peacefully. I mean, for the most part, people were pretty tolerant of each other's faiths.
A real spiritual smorgasbord. But then you had the Jews, who were staunchly monotheistic in this polytheistic world. They clung fiercely to their one God and the leftovers of Moses, even after periods of doubt and rebellion earlier in their history.
Right, like you'd think witnessing events like the Exodus would solidify their faith, but, doubt persisted.
Yeah, what do you make of that?
I think it speaks to this human need for certainty, especially in times of uncertainty and hardship.
Okay, so when the going gets tough, you cling to what,
Yeah, exactly. When the evidence feels less tangible, the grip on faith might actually tighten.
It makes sense. So their faith, as Gibbon suggests, was excellent for preserving their identity, but not so much for winning converts. I mean, those strict laws and customs, especially circumcision, weren't exactly attractive to outsiders.
Right. Judaism was primarily inherited, passed down through generations, not actively spread. You didn't see a lot of missionary work going on.
But then along comes Christianity, building upon those same Jewish foundations, but with a more universally appealing message.
You could say that.
Christianity, Judaism 2.0. So how did they tweak the model for mass appeal?
Well, they kept the core conviction, the passion of their Jewish roots, but they addressed those conversion barriers head on.
They streamlined the system.
Exactly. Instead of the elaborate location-specific rituals of the Mosaic Law, they emphasized a more spiritual, universally applicable form of worship. And they extended God's promise of favor to all humanity, not just the descendants of Abraham.
So a more inclusive message, if you will.
Yeah, you could say that.
So it seems like they tapped into the existing fervor and streamlined the whole system. But wouldn't this create some tension between the Jewish Christians who wanted to retain Mosaic practices and the Gentile converts who weren't keen on them?
Oh, absolutely. This tension played out dramatically within the early church.
I can imagine.
You had Jewish Christians who saw their faith as a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, not a replacement.
Right.
And then you had Gentile converts who were resistant to adopting Jewish customs.
So how did they navigate this theological tightrope?
Well, the early church leaders took a cautious approach. They gradually unfolded Christian doctrines, gently steering away from the old laws while attempting to bridge the two worlds.
Sort of easing them into the new way of thinking?
Exactly. A good example of this is the Jerusalem church, which was led by Jewish bishops for over a century.
Wow.
This shows a gradual transition rather than an abrupt break.
They were trying to find that middle ground.
Yeah, appease both sides. But inevitably, this tension led to a split.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So who are the casualties of this split?
Well, a fascinating example is the Ebionites.
Ebionites, okay.
They were caught between the two faiths, clinging to elements of both.
A bit of a hybrid.
Yeah, you could say that. They highlight the human struggle to reconcile deeply held beliefs with new revelations.
The challenge of change.
Exactly. And the challenges of maintaining unity in the face of diverse interpretations.
It's a reminder that even in matters of faith, the human element with all its complexities plays a central role. It's not just about doctrines and scriptures, but about people wrestling with tradition change and those deeply personal convictions.
You got it. And this brings us to another point. Gibbon raises the Christians' staunch opposition to paganism. They weren't merely coexisting with those other beliefs. They saw them as a direct threat.
So not exactly playing nice in the religious sandbox.
Not quite. They believed the Roman gods were malevolent demons actively seeking to deceive humanity.
Oh.
A full-blown spiritual war in their eyes.
So even everyday activities, even seemingly harmless ones, could be seen as leading to demonic influence.
Exactly.
This paints a much more intense picture of early Christianity than we usually see. Were they always this confrontational?
Well, it's important to understand the context of their beliefs. This us versus them mentality, this meticulous avoidance of anything remotely pagan, it wasn't just about religious purity.
It went deeper than that.
Exactly. It was also about group cohesion. It fostered a powerful sense of belonging in a world where their beliefs were often met with suspicion and hostility. It was about survival as much as faith.
Sticking together in the face of opposition.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how much of our perception of reality, even today, is shaped by our belief systems.
I think it's a profound question worth pondering.
What we consider harmless or threatening is often a product of the lens through which we view the world.
Absolutely. But moving on, another factor that contributed to Christianity's appeal was its promise of an afterlife, something that contrasted sharply with the more ambiguous views of the Greeks and Romans.
Right. Even the most renowned philosophers only hinted at an afterlife focusing primarily on living a virtuous life here and now.
Yeah, and Jewish beliefs on the afterlife were a relatively late development.
Christianity, however, offered a much more concrete and vivid vision of what awaited after death.
Absolutely. They painted a detailed picture of heaven and hell and emphasized the imminent end of the world.
So the stakes were high.
Very high. This created a sense of urgency, a feeling that, you had to make a choice now.
Almost like a cosmic sales pitch. Get on board now or face the consequences.
Yeah.
Talk about motivation. But Gibbon also mentions these incredible stories of miracles performed by early Christians, speaking in tongues, visions, exorcisms, even bringing people back from the dead. From a modern perspective, it's a lot to take in.
It is. Today, we might approach these claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right, of course.
But we need to remember that the ancient world had a very different understanding of the supernatural.
Right. It was a different time.
Miracles weren't easily dismissed. They were seen as a real possibility.
Imagine witnessing these events firsthand. It must have been mind-blowing. This belief in the possibility of miracles, coupled with the already existing fervor, likely made accepting the extraordinary claims of the Gospels much easier.
Absolutely. It added another layer of legitimacy to their faith.
So they had the conviction, the promise of a better afterlife, and now tangible evidence of the divine at work.
They had it all.
What else drew people to this fledgling faith?
Well, their morality also played a crucial role. They emphasized repentance and striving for a purer life.
Moral code.
Right, which resonated with those seeking redemption and a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about believing, it was about living differently.
So it was a package deal, a new belief system, a supportive community, and a moral code that set them apart from Roman society.
Precisely.
What were some of the key differences?
Their moral code stood in stark contrast to Roman norms, particularly when it came to sexual morality, material possessions, and violence.
Okay, let's break that down.
All right, so they championed chastity, strict marriage rules, and idealized celibacy, rejecting the often lax Roman attitudes towards sexuality.
Quite a contrast.
Yeah, and they also renounced luxury and worldly ambition, emphasizing simple living and communal sharing.
And if I'm not mistaken, they were also pacifists. That seems pretty ironic considering what came later.
We're not mistaken. The irony isn't lost on us.
Yeah.
But at this time, their pacifism was a radical stance in a militaristic society like Rome.
Turning the other cheek.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They rejected violence, even in self-defense, believing that true strength lay in spiritual resistance. It was a countercultural movement that offered a sense of belonging and purpose, particularly for those who felt disillusioned by Roman society.
Finding meaning in a world that seemed to have lost its way.
Exactly.
It's incredible how a movement built on such radical ideals could, in time, become so intertwined with power and worldly affairs.
Right.
It speaks to the complex relationship between ideals and reality, between the purity of faith and the often messy realities of human ambition and societal pressures.
And that brings us to our final factor for today, the organizational structure of the early church. What started as decentralized, independent communities eventually evolved into a more hierarchical system, with bishops at the helm.
So they went from a collection of self-governing groups to something resembling the Catholic Church we know today. How did that happen?
Well, it was a gradual process driven by the need for structure and unity as the movement grew larger and more geographically dispersed.
Makes sense. Things get complicated as you grow.
They do. Initially, prophets played a key role, spontaneously sharing inspired messages during gatherings.
Sort of a free-flowing structure.
Yeah, but as communities expanded, this model became unsustainable.
Too much room for chaos and conflicting interpretations.
Exactly. This led to disruptions and abuses of power, highlighting the need for a more stable leadership structure.
So they needed someone to take charge.
Yeah, and gradually the role of established ministers, initially called bishops and presbyters, terms that originally referred to the same position, took precedence.
Okay, so how did bishops end up at the top of the hierarchy?
It was a more organic process. The need for consistent leadership, especially as communities grew larger and more geographically dispersed, led to the elevation of bishops above presbyters.
So a natural evolution from a flat structure to a more pyramid-shaped one. But I imagine this shift didn't sit well with everyone.
You're right. There was pushback, especially from the lower clergy who felt their authority diminishing. Those who opposed the bishops were often labeled as troublemakers, promoting faction and schism. Ambitious bishops like Cyprian of Carthage skillfully used their influence to silence these dissenting voices.
So the seeds of religious conflict and power struggles were already being sown even in these early days. It makes you think about how the need for order and unity can sometimes lead to the concentration of power, even in movements that initially champion equality and decentralization.
Absolutely. It's a theme that echoes throughout human history.
Indeed. But we'll delve deeper into those power dynamics and how they shaped the early church in part 2 of our deep dive.
Definitely more to come.
Until then, I'm really struck by how early Christianity managed to balance these seemingly contradictory elements, radical ideals, with savvy organizational strategies, passionate faith, with a keen understanding of human nature.
It's a fascinating mix.
It's a much more complex and multifaceted story than I initially realized.
It really is. And it raises some intriguing questions.
Oh, like what?
Well, were these early Christians truly as unified as they appeared? Did their focus on the afterlife impact their engagement with earthly issues? And how did their organizational choices shape the future of the church?
Those are some excellent points to ponder. We'll pick up these threads and explore them further in part 2. For now, I'm definitely feeling the weight of those early choices and how they rippled through history.
It's a story that keeps unfolding. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about those early independent Christian communities, and how they started to evolve into a more structured system, with bishops gaining more and more authority.
Right, and that shift wasn't without its critics.
Right.
But as the movement grew, the need for greater organization and doctrinal consistency became more and more apparent.
Exactly. And this is where those provincial synods come into the picture. They started popping up around the end of the 2nd century.
Oh, yeah, those synods.
Yeah.
What were they exactly, and what role did they play in this shift towards greater centralization?
Picture these regional councils, kind of like those old Greek assemblies where bishops from all over a province would gather twice a year to hash things out. They'd bring along a few presbyters, those ministers who served alongside the bishop,
right.
And often crowds of onlookers would gather as well.
Wow, so it was a real who's who of early Christianity.
Yeah, it was a big event.
So what went down at these synods? Were they just social gatherings, or did they have a more concrete purpose?
They were far from mere social gatherings.
Okay.
These synods were where the nitty-gritty of Christian doctrine and practice got hammered out.
Ah, so this is where they ironed out the wrinkles.
Exactly. Through decrees called canons, they tried to settle theological disputes, address emerging issues, and maintain some semblance of unity across different churches.
So it was like establishing the official rule book for Christianity.
Right.
Making sure everyone was on the same page, so to speak.
Exactly. And of course, all of this was infused with the belief that the Holy Spirit was guiding their decisions.
Right. Of course, lending their pronouncements a weighty authority.
You got it.
But couldn't this also be seen as a way for ambitious bishops to consolidate their power?
That's a good point. As these councils gained authority, individual churches inevitably lost some of their autonomy.
Right, they had to give up some control.
Yeah, and bishops, especially those who held sway within the synods, found themselves wielding greater influence.
And I bet the Roman Church, being at the heart of the empire, didn't hesitate to leverage its position in this whole power shift.
You know it. The Roman Church, the largest and most influential in the West, had a trump card. Their direct lineage back to Peter, considered the first pope.
Playing the lineage card.
Exactly. They claimed a special kind of authority based on this apostolic succession.
So, we're descended from the OG apostle, therefore we're in charge.
Pretty much. They asserted what they called a primacy of order and association.
A fancy way of saying they deserve top billing in the Christian leadership club.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled with Rome calling the shots. Weren't there other churches with their own claims to authority and influence?
Oh, absolutely. There was considerable pushback, especially from those fiercely independent churches in the East.
Okay.
Cyprian, that bishop from Carthage we mentioned earlier, was a vocal critic of Rome's claims. He rallied support from other churches, arguing for a more decentralized model of authority.
So it wasn't just smooth sailing towards a unified church. Sounds like there were some real power struggles going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it was like a Punic war of the religious world, thankfully fought with words and cannons, not swords and legions.
Thankfully.
What's fascinating is that even today, Catholic scholars tend to gloss over this period where you had these prominent figures of the early church saints even clashing with each other with such, well, unsaintly zeal.
It's a good reminder that even these larger-than-life figures were human, driven by ambition, conviction, and perhaps even a bit of ego. Their disagreements and power struggles add a layer of complexity and frankly make the story much more interesting.
I agree. But let's shift our focus to another key aspect of this organizational evolution, the growing distinction between clergy and laity.
Right, that separation between those ordained for religious service, the clergy, and the everyday members, the laity. This seems like a pretty significant development, something that sets Christianity apart from other religions of the time.
It was a defining feature of the emerging church.
Okay.
Unlike the more fluid religious roles in Roman society, Christianity formalized this division, and as you might imagine, this distinction wasn't always harmonious.
I bet there were power struggles galore. The clergy trying to assert their authority, the laity pushing back, perhaps yearning for the more egalitarian early model.
Exactly. There were definitely tensions, but there was also a shared commitment to spreading the faith, which sometimes masked individual ambition.
Right, so under the banner of spreading the gospel.
Exactly. Those ambitious bishops and martyrs, they were also driven by the desire to expand their own influence.
So it wasn't all kumbaya and brotherly love within those early Christian communities?
Hardly. The human element, with all its flaws and complexities, was very much at play.
As always.
But as we've seen, that's what makes history so compelling, right? It's not a neat and tidy tale of saints and heroes. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's full of those unintended consequences that keep us on our toes.
Absolutely. But I'm still curious about how the church actually exercised its authority. They didn't have armies or the power to tax or punish people like the Roman government did.
They may not have had worldly power, but they wielded something far more potent, the power of rewards and punishments tied to eternal salvation or damnation.
Whoa. Okay, talking about motivation. It's like a cosmic carrot and stick.
Yeah.
So let's break down how they use this spiritual currency, shall we?
Let's start with the reward side of the equation. Remember that community of goods idea we discussed earlier where early Christians pooled their resources and shared everything?
Yeah.
Well, that didn't last very long.
Human nature being what it is,
Yeah.
I can imagine people got attached to their stuff.
Yeah.
So what system did they come up with to replace it?
They transitioned to a system of voluntary contributions with a strong emphasis on tithing, giving 10% of your income to the church, just like in the Old Testament.
Okay.
But they cleverly framed this not just as a financial obligation, but as an act of faith and generosity, especially with the world supposedly ending soon.
Right. Practical and spiritual.
Yeah.
I like it. But where did all that money go? Did the bishops just use it to build lavish palaces for themselves?
Not exactly. While some portion undoubtedly went to supporting the clergy and maintaining the churches,
Right.
a significant chunk was dedicated to helping the poor and needy widows, orphans, the sick prisoners, even travelers.
Wow, that's actually quite impressive. It's like a proto-social safety net, centuries before anything like that existed.
You got it. And as Gibbon points out, this generosity was a major selling point for Christianity. Even pagans who scoffed at their doctrines couldn't help but admire their acts of charity.
It's a powerful reminder that religion at its best can be a force for good in the world.
Absolutely. But let's not forget that other side of the coin, the stick. The church also had ways of enforcing conformity and punishing those who strayed from the path.
Right. So what kind of stick are we talking about?
That's where excommunication comes in, being kicked out of the Christian community.
Ooh, I can imagine that was a pretty big deal back then.
Yeah.
You're cut off from your social network, your support system, and most importantly, your path to eternal salvation.
No kidding. It wasn't just about punishing individual sinners. It was also a way to maintain doctrinal purity, weed out heretics, and deter others from straying.
Protecting the flock. But surely they didn't banish people forever, for every little mistake. Was there a formal process for determining who deserved to be excommunicated?
They did have a process, and it varied depending on the severity of the offense.
Okay.
Minor slip-ups might get you a stern talking to from your bishop.
Right.
But serious transgressions, adultery, murder, persistent idolatry, those could lead to a lengthy period of public penance.
Public penance. Okay, paint me a picture. What did that involve?
Imagine public confessions, fasting, wearing sackcloth, and basically groveling at the door of the church, begging for forgiveness.
That sounds pretty intense. But for most offenses, there was a path back to the fold, right? They didn't just permanently banish people for every little misstep.
For most offenses, yes, there was a way back.
Okay.
But certain actions, especially repeated offenses after being forgiven, could result in permanent excommunication. And as you can imagine, this created a lot of anxiety and fear. Imagine the weight of that judgment, the feeling of being cast out from the only community that truly understands you, and the terror of facing eternal damnation.
It must have been a terrifying prospect.
It was, but it also highlights that even within this system of spiritual discipline, the human element was still very much present.
Right, so it wasn't just a cold, hard system.
No, Gibbon points out that not all bishops wielded this power responsibly. Some were more lenient, others incredibly harsh, leading to inconsistencies, and at times abuses of authority.
So the human factor always comes into play.
Always. The story of early Christianity is riddled with these contradictions. On the one hand, this profound message of love, forgiveness, and compassion, and on the other, power struggle, social control, and the very human tendency to judge and punish.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray, making it all the more fascinating to explore. But before we get too lost in those grays, let's shift gears a bit. We've been focusing on the big picture, the doctrines, the organization. I'm curious, what was it actually like to be an early Christian navigating daily life in a pagan world?
That's a great question. It's one thing to talk about beliefs and structures, but it's quite another to imagine the lived experience of these early Christians.
All right, we need to get down to the street level.
To truly understand their rise, we need to step into their shoes, feel the pressures they faced, and grasp the impact of their beliefs on their everyday lives.
Okay, I'm ready to time travel. Set the scene for me. What challenges did they face, and how did their faith shape their interactions with the world around them? All right, so we're stepping into the shoes of those early Christians, living in a world where their beliefs were not just different,
right,
but often seen as a threat to Roman society.
It wasn't easy being a Christian back then. Imagine, your neighbors seeing your God as this dangerous superstition,
right,
where the rituals and festivals that bind your community together are considered acts of demonic worship.
Yeah, that must have been incredibly isolating, being set apart from the mainstream. Did they live in separate communities like the Jewish ghettos of later centuries?
Not exactly. While some Christians may have clustered together for the most part, they lived integrated amongst their pagan neighbors.
So they were right in the thick of it.
Yeah, which made their commitment to their faith all the more challenging.
I can imagine.
It demanded constant vigilance against the traps of pagan life.
What kind of traps? I mean, we've touched on this before, but I'd love to get a clearer picture of what this actually looked like in their daily lives.
Yeah.
What were these traps they had to avoid?
Think about it. Roman religion was so deeply intertwined with everyday life. Attending public games dedicated to specific gods, decorating your house with laurel branches, even wearing a flower garland.
Yeah, those sound pretty harmless.
They do, but these actions could be seen as acts of idolatry.
Wow. So it was about so much more than just, attending temple ceremonies.
Right.
It was about navigating a world where nearly every aspect of public life was infused with pagan symbolism.
Exactly. And this constant need to scrutinize every action, every interaction, it must have created a profound sense of us versus them.
Right, so it reinforced their sense of separation.
Exactly. They relied on each other for support, encouragement, and a sense of belonging in a world that often viewed them with suspicion.
It's like living in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance,
Yeah.
adhering to your beliefs while surrounded by a culture that contradicts them at every turn.
Exactly.
No wonder they clung so tightly to their faith in each other.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But this separation from the wider Roman world, it wasn't just about religious purity. It also had social and political implications.
Oh.
In what way? Well, Gibbon calls it their indolent or even criminal disregard to the public welfare.
Wait, didn't we just talk about how charitable they were? How can that be considered a disregard for the public good?
Their charity was undeniable, but their commitment to pacifism and their focus on the afterlife led them to withdraw from certain aspects of public life that the Romans considered essential, particularly military service and public office.
Ah, okay, so while they cared for the poor and sick within their communities,
Right.
they were less enthusiastic about participating in those systems that upheld Roman society as a whole.
Exactly. And in a militaristic empire like Rome, I imagine their refusal to serve in the legions raised some eyebrows.
More than a few, I'm sure.
Critics argued that if everyone adopted the Christians' pacifist stance, the empire would be left defenseless against barbarian invaders.
A valid concern, I suppose.
It was. And so the Christians had to come up with counterarguments.
What did they say?
Well, some pointed to the imminent end of the world,
Okay,
suggesting that earthly concerns like military defense were ultimately pointless.
right. Not worth worrying about.
Others emphasized the importance of spiritual warfare, arguing that their prayers and moral example were more effective in protecting the empire than any earthly army.
So faith over force?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, but I doubt it satisfied their Roman critics.
Probably not. But Gibbon points out an interesting historical irony.
Yeah, what's that?
That this very detachment from Roman institutions, this refusal to engage in those systems that they saw as corrupt or violent, actually ended up working in their favor.
Oh, that's right. It's fascinating how that worked out.
How so?
It shielded them from the political turmoil and corruption that plagued Roman society during this period.
Ah, so they were insulated from the chaos.
Exactly, allowing them to focus on building their own communities and strengthening their internal bonds.
Smart.
It also inadvertently made them less threatening to the authorities, at least in those early years.
So their withdrawal, whether intentional or not, provided a kind of protective buffer,
Yeah.
allowing them to grow and flourish beneath the radar of the Roman state.
Exactly.
And this highlights that constant tension within religious movements.
Yeah.
The balance between engaging with the world and preserving the purity of one's faith.
It's a tough one.
Too much engagement and you risk compromising your ideals. Too much withdrawal and you become irrelevant. Finding that sweet spot is crucial for any movement seeking to make a lasting impact.
Absolutely.
It's a fascinating dilemma and one that we still grapple with today, in all sorts of contexts.
Definitely.
So looking back on this deep dive into early Christianity, what key takeaways would you leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history, particularly religious history, is rarely as simple or straightforward as we might imagine.
Right, it's always more complicated than it seems.
The story of early Christianity is a story of contradictions,
Yeah.
of radical ideals and pragmatic compromises, of profound faith, and very human struggles for power.
It challenges our assumptions and forces us to reconsider those easy narratives we often tell ourselves about the past.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even the most impactful movements, those that shape the course of history, are ultimately driven by the choices and actions of individuals, each with their own motivations, flaws, and aspirations.
Well said. It's been an incredible journey, peeling back the layers of history and exploring the multifaceted rise of this faith that would go on to transform the world.
It really has. And hopefully it sparks further exploration and encourages our listeners to, delve deeper into those fascinating historical nuances that often get overlooked.
Because as we've seen, it's in those nuances, those messy contradictions, that the real story lies. So to our listeners, keep questioning, keep digging, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history. There's always more to uncover.